And now let's hear from our champion, Coco Gauff. Coco, you burst onto the scene about 4 years ago. A lot of expectations on your shoulders. What does it mean to win your first Grand Slam title on home soil?
Oh my goodness. It means so much to me. I feel like I'm a little bit in shock in this moment. You know, that French Open loss was a heartbreak for me, but I realized, you know, God puts you through tribulations and trials, and this makes this moment even sweeter than I can imagine. I'm just thankful for this moment. I don't have any words for it, to be honest.
Arena came out super strong today. Where did you find the belief to turn this match around?
I don't know. I just knew that if I didn't give it my all, you know, I had no shot at winning. Arena's an incredible player. Congratulations on the #1 ranking. It's well-deserved. I always tell my team all the time that, you know, you're a really nice person behind the scenes, and the competitive and the fire that you bring to the court is something that makes sports better. So congratulations to you and your team for this result.
And what about your team? You had a great embrace with your mom and dad. They've been with you through thick and thin. Your brothers are back at home, your grandmother. What message do you have for all of them?
Can I take the mic for this one?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. God. Well, thank you first to my parents. Today was the first time I've ever seen my dad cry. He doesn't want me to tell you all that. But he got caught in 4K. You know, he thinks he's so hard, but you know, it's not. So thank you guys. I mean, you believed in me from the beginning. I've been coming to this tournament. My dad took me to this tournament, sitting right there watching Venus and Serena compete. So it's really incredible to be on this stage.
I just read your numbers, including a title. Something about New York brings out the best in you. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to ask Novak, what are you still doing here? Come on. I mean, no, jokes apart. I mean, what is it, our third final? Maybe not the last, who hope so. I mean, because you're probably going to be in many more. I don't know when are you planning to slow down a little bit, but congrats to you and your team. I mean, 24. I feel like I have not a bad career and I have 20 titles. You have 24 Grand Slams. Wow. And so, yeah, congrats to you and your team. You guys are amazing. You know, he pushes me to be better. And I said this one time in Australia, but I'm going to say it again because it's a different city, new people. First, we met when I was probably 500 in the world. And he was super kind to me, you know, nothing special, but he treated me as a normal person, where I was surprised. I was like, wow, that's amazing, you know. And he still does, nothing changed. 24, 30, 12 Grand Slams, nothing changes, and I think that's something great about a person, you can say.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the tennis. Congratulations. Novak, 50 years ago at the U.S. Open, Margaret Court won number 24. Total different era. You've come through the golden era. You have 24. What does it mean?
Well, I don't know where to start. It obviously means the world to me. You know, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I have to say it every time that I'm really living my childhood dream, you know, to compete at the highest level in the sport that has given me and my family so much, you know, coming from very difficult circumstances and adversities during 90s, couple of wars in our country, and being able to push that through, especially for my parents, giving a lot of sacrifice to support me, to play. I love you. Thank you so much. Enough talking about myself, you know, because Daniil said too many nice words, and sorry I didn't start congratulating you. I want to congratulate you for a fantastic tournament. I'm sorry about the result today, and please don't get this in the wrong way. Happy anniversary to your wife. I'm sorry. It comes from a good place, honestly. It's not. If I knew that the anniversary is today, maybe the result. Jokes aside, Daniil has been incredibly nice and kind to me, to my team. I think since you were, a junior, 14, 15, you started training with your coach, and it's nice to see the evolution of your relationship, professional relationship, what you have achieved, what you have done, and I know that there is a lot more for you to achieve in the future years. So good luck with that for sure. You will win more slams, no doubt. And I just want to say that you, sir, mentioned what you love about Daniil, and I agree with you. I think he has definitely the most authentic personality out there, and never change, please, with your celebrations, with your, comments. I love it. Definitely the best.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 40 of Life and Life Only. This is a little bit of an impromptu one, prompted by the events of the weekend in sport, specifically tennis. I've been meaning to do a podcast about tennis for ages, actually, but I was trying to find a way where I could fit it to the Lalo, Life and Life Only format. I was considering just doing a standalone video because I just wanted to talk about the what they call the G.O.A.T debate. G.O.A.T is the greatest of all time, various other things. But watching the finals of the US Open and having watched the French Open, Wimbledon and the US Open, in fact, over the last 3 months, there's so much material with tennis in terms of sports psychology and in terms of, as you'll know if you see the title of the podcast, media and fame. There's just so much material that after the finals, I was actually at work the next day and I had a bit of a lull and I started writing notes. So you could say I was getting paid to prepare this podcast, and I don't know if you ever find this, but when you're getting paid for things, when you're able to do things at work, it seems sweeter somehow, and the ideas generator started going and didn't stop for about 10 minutes, and I had enough for a podcast. So let's see how this goes. The other thing that happened last week was I was perusing a charity shop, as I do here in England, and I happened upon the book The Inner Game of Tennis, which I had read years ago, but it seemed appropriate since the US Open was still going on. I found it very inspiring, and I thought we should talk about sports psychology, like I said. Also, since I've been absorbed in mainstream media content of the tennis, and also in my car as well, I'll get to that in a sec, where normally, because I don't have a TV, I tend to seek out alternative media, as you know, and of course put out alternative media content. Yeah, I thought there was plenty there. And I mean, these top tennis players are big stars now, and it's a sport that's seen a lot of casualties of fame, let's be honest. Jennifer Capriati, I guess, is a famous example, but there are ones in very recent years, which I'm going to get to, and one's actually arguably happening now. I did do a previous episode of Life and Life Only with a sporting flavour, in fact, looking at table tennis, which is the sport I play myself, and nerves. That was episode 18, The Way of the Nervous Official. I called it a tragicomedy about table tennis, and it was based on a true story, but I tweaked a few details. But I did also talk about nerves, and I think I mentioned Jana Novotná and the Wimbledon final of 1993, which is very, very difficult to watch. I did have a look back at some of it, and it's you feel for her. That was a famous occasion where she choked. That's the expression they use for it, when you're about to win and the nerves get to you and your game falls apart. Now, the Inner Game of Tennis uses tennis as a springboard to talk about, let's say, personal psychology as a whole, and performance in any field. Rather like, if you know my other podcast, or one of my other podcasts, Glass Onion on John Lennon, I use John Lennon as a springboard to talk about all kinds of other things. Some of the ideas in the book will be quite common now due to the influence of the book, really, and that's the sad trick, isn't it, that others copy and update your ideas, so then you suddenly seem out of date, even though the ideas came from you. I mean, I don't think it formulated these ideas, but it came out in 1974, and I don't think sports psychology was as much of a thing then, clearly, as it is now. But I found it very inspiring, and just to pick one idea from it, there's an idea in there that the battle is against yourself. And I remember listening to Sylvester Stallone's commentary on the DVD of Rocky, and he sort of says that when Rocky's fighting Apollo Creed, he's really fighting against himself, because if you know that film, he's trying to prove he can go the proverbial, literally 15 rounds, which has now been reduced to 12 rounds, by the way, in boxing. But it's the proverbial 15 rounds as well, the 15 rounds of life. And it's, can you stay on your feet when you're being pummeled by the best boxer in the world? It's that idea. And that the result, in a way, doesn't matter if you believe you've made the greatest effort and you've pushed your limits. That's a crucial thing, really. Now, that depends on the level you're playing at. I'm sure if you lose a big US Open final or any big final, that's a difficult pill to swallow. And I'm sure, Sabalenka and Medvedev are feeling that. And I can only imagine, that deflation. But there's obviously something to the idea as well that if you play badly and win, okay, at the top level, you're still the champion and you've had a career boost, but you may still feel a bit down. And we've seen that really because Sabalenka is now the world number one in the new rankings, because the previous number one, Iga Swiatek, went out in an earlier round. So Sabalenka is now world number one. But there was quite a poignant moment where she was doing her encore interview, and whoever it was who was interviewing her says, "Irene, you're now the world number one." And there was a big cheer, and you could just see on Sabalenka's face, she's thinking, yeah, I'm the world number one, but I didn't win this fucking match, did I? I'm a loser today. So that doesn't mean quite as much. But I think at a lower level where the stakes are not so high, I think that personal satisfaction factor maybe is even higher, Let me give you my thoughts on the singles finals anyway. Like I said, talking about tennis, and it's really reaching a fascinating stage at the moment, the sport in general. So, tennis is brutal at the highest level. It's a bit like boxing, but they're bludgeoning each other using, with a tennis racket and a tennis ball rather than directly. There's a podcast I listen to called The Tennis Podcast, and the phrase that the host, Catherine, uses, they go to scary places. These guys really are pushing it to the limits, and it's not very glamorous. Yeah, it's glamorous when you win. It's glamorous when you get the trophy and they hand you a massive check and everything, and you go and hug your family and all that. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But, it's probably really bad for you as well, really bad for your body as well. Maybe the Tour de France is more brutal, when they're going up in those hills. And, of course, even the winner of the Tour de France is not going to get the financial rewards and the fame, if that's what they're after, that the tennis players will get. But if you look on YouTube, look up the match Djokovic and Nadal in Australia. I can't remember which year it was, maybe about 10 years ago, perhaps a bit less. I think it was the longest Grand Slam final ever. They played nearly 6 hours, and you just cannot believe they're still standing at the end of it. And that's 6 hours of seriously high-octane tennis. But I think just as boxing is sanitized by TV, because I went to a few fights and then I stopped going because I didn't really like it, to be honest. We see these tennis players looking pretty tired, and we think, they're pretty tired, Same way we might be tired if we played tennis for an hour at our local club or ran up a hill or something. So I go back to this point that their lives are not generally glamorous. I'm going to get onto that later, but they're like touring musicians in a way, because the tennis tour is absolutely brutal in terms of the travel and being away from your family, because if you don't play enough tournaments, your ranking will go down. And then, of course, the further your ranking goes down, the more you're likely to play a top player in the earlier rounds of a competition. So it's like a vicious cycle, really. But, in the same way that you might envy rock stars going out on tour, and you think, oh, great, they get to have all that adrenaline and adulation and all that sex. And, but all that stuff, again, it sounds great up to a point, but then I bet it can get old really, really quickly. And one of the things actually I love in both boxing and tennis, and I'm comparing those partly because I think they are quite comparable, but also they're the only real sports now that I pay attention to. I used to love football when I was a kid in the 80s and into the 90s, and I was one of those kids who pretty much followed every sport. Rugby, not so much, but really tennis and boxing, the only ones I'm particularly interested in now. I like the bits where they embrace at the end. In tennis they embrace at the net, and in boxing as well, because they respect each other for putting themselves through it. Particularly boxing, I'd say, obviously, because it's got that element of violence and you are risking your life, whereas in a tennis match, you're not really risking your life. I hope there've never been any fatalities at a tennis match. The fatalities in boxing are incredibly rare, in fact, but obviously you're doing quite a lot of damage to the other person in terms of brain damage and so forth. So Gauff and Sabalenka, one of the other guys on this tennis podcast said, in a way, every match is on Sabalenka's racket because she's such a good power player and her strokes are so aggressive. And her problem, of course, is always that she doesn't have a plan B. She just, again, like boxing, if you think of, I don't know, early George Foreman, she's a bit like that, you know. George Foreman did have a bit more technique than people give him credit for. And there's a good video on the YouTube channel, The Modern Martial Artist. But it was fascinating because Gauff basically had to keep the ball in play and wait for Sabalenka to make an unforced error. And I say unforced error in inverted commas because you might say that none of these errors are really unforced, but you know what I mean. Gauff won ugly, as the phrase says, as her coach Brad Gilbert was telling her, you know, keep it physical, win ugly and all that. But then, you know, Coco did have a chance to play a few shots at the end, and of course she ended the match with a winner. And then, you know, they had this amazing moment where she just broke down and just burst into tears, and she said it was tears of joy rather than relief. But I think, I mean, obviously it's a mixture of loads of other things, but I'm reminded of Steve Davis, who swept all before him in the 80s and has come out of it, really. He was known then as a robot and boring. Yeah, they called him interesting on Spitting Image, ironically. But Steve's actually got a great sense of humour, and he cried his eyes out when he first won the World Snooker, but he said it is relief, and he said, I would have cried if I'd lost. It's that relief that it's all over and the release of the pressure. But, you know, seeing Coco embracing her dad and all her family and everything, I mean, she is absolutely adorable. But partly, I think, because she's a strange mixture. She's quite, when you listen to her speak on the mic, she seems very confident. I think she is confident, seems to like speaking, but she's also very, very vulnerable. And you can see that because she's had a few moments. I mean, there seem to be so many clips of her in floods of tears. I mean, she was in tears when she lost to Naomi Osaka, who I will be mentioning later as well. And there's a lovely clip with subtitles where Osaka's consoling her and says, do you want to come up with me when I get my trophy, or whatever it was. And, you know, it was a nice moment. And Coco was in tears when she lost the French to Swiatek. I think that was last year. And I think she's suffering. And I think behind all the joy of victory, I'm not sure if things are going to get better for her. I mean, maybe part of the celebration is that I'm a Grand Slam champion, so maybe people will leave me alone. I don't know. I don't know how many Grand Slams she actually wants to win. You know, there's this massive assumption in the media that everyone wants to be number one. Everyone wants to win as much as possible. But maybe they actually don't. Maybe they want to win one Grand Slam, make $3 million and be left alone to some extent. But obviously she's not going to get left alone now. I mean, she's going to be an even bigger star. And I fear for her, frankly. When they handed her that check for $3 million, I was thinking of the George Harrison quote, to paraphrase something like, for every £1 million you get, it brings 1 million problems, you know. And believe me, the vultures will be circling. On the subject of money, I'm just going to play a little humorous clip. This is Sloane Stephens, who won the US Open women's singles in 2017, answering some truly inane questions from the media with a couple of funny replies.
I know this is kind of fresh, but having done this once, does it give you a hunger to win another slam, to do this again, feel this feeling again?
Of course, girl. Did you see that check that lady handed me? Like, yes. Man, if that doesn't make you want to play tennis, I don't know what will. Man. So, yes, definitely.
If I'm not mistaken, it's been 20 years since somebody in a women's final at the US Open managed to score a 6-0. Does it make you feel a little bit bad for Madison, maybe?
Bad for her? Yes. She was in the finals, too. What do you mean? Did you see the check she's about to get? I'm sure she'll be just fine.
So, yeah, good timing there from Sloane. Great delivery, comic delivery. I suppose the bit about that I don't like is the glorification of money, but I mean, that's not her fault. But I like this truth aspect. You know, very occasionally you get sportsmen who'll say, I like the money. We always feel like they have to say, oh, it's about the title, it's not about the money, when clearly it is partly about the money. So, yeah, that was the women's. And then the men's final, Djokovic and Medvedev. I mean, Djokovic looked absolutely dead on his feet in the second set. The second set was 1 hour and 45 minutes. The match wasn't a classic, but at least there was a classic set. But I thought Djokovic was in real trouble, because if he'd lost that second set, I'm fairly convinced he would have lost the match. And I can't even imagine, I mean, that was after 2 sets and they'd played however long they played, 2.5 hours, or, you know, again, very high octane tennis. I can't imagine what state they would have been in if that had gone to 5. But the thing I wanted to point out is how the mental side and the situation affects the physical. Just as we saw at Wimbledon, Djokovic and Alcaraz, Djokovic had a point to go 2 sets to love up. And I think he would have won that match if he'd gone 2 sets to love up. 3 points later, it's 1 set all. And the difference between 2 sets to love and 1 set all at this level is so enormous that Djokovic's body responding to going 2 sets to love up is so different to 1 set all, because even though, you know, his body is it's been brutalized in the same way by a 1 hour, 45 minute set, when you go 2 sets to love up, suddenly his body says to him, oh, I'm fine now. What are you worrying about? You know, and he went out and he had a little break and he put his head under the cold tap or whatever he did, and wasn't going to lose after that, let's be honest. And in terms of the GOAT debate, let me chuck out a few names to you, most of which will be fairly obvious, but I'll separate the men's and women's side. I think on the women's side, Martina Navratilova, as time goes on, becomes a more significant figure because the game has got more physical. And Martina was one of the first players to really take fitness seriously. And she was one of the main ones that brought the game from that slightly more genteel tennis that you saw in, say, the 50s and 60s, definitely, and into the early 70s. And then suddenly, for good or bad, you know, you might think that's a bad thing. I don't necessarily. I think she's really significant, and she won 18 Grand Slam titles, but she also won a ton of doubles titles. I should also have a word for her big rival, Chris Evert. It's funny that when I was a kid, we got loads and loads of Wimbledon on TV, but we didn't really get the other Grand Slams so much. And it took me years to realise that Evert and Navratilova actually won the same amount of Grand Slam singles titles, 18, as I said. But Evert won most of hers, well, not most, but Evert won a lot of hers at the French Open. And all I ever saw at Wimbledon was Navratilova beating Evert. So in my mind, I always thought of her as better. Yeah, I put Navratilova well up there. Steffi Graf won 22 Grand Slams, but there's a couple of minus points. I don't think she was a groundbreaking player. I think she was very athletic. She had a fantastic forehand, possibly the best forehand up to that point. But the two things that go against her is that Sabatini kind of bottled it in the 1991 Wimbledon final, and the aforementioned Novotna in the 1993 final basically had beaten Graf. She had 2 breaks of serve. She was 4-1 up on serve in the final set. The other thing, which is even more important, is what happened to Monica Seles. Now, if you know the story, I mean, this is just awful. Seles had won, I think, 8 Grand Slam titles by the age of 19 and basically was sweeping all before her. The only one she couldn't win was Wimbledon. So Graf had a measure on grass, but she had Graf's measure on the other surfaces, the other Grand Slams, basically. And then, of course, she was stabbed by an obsessed fan in Hamburg, I think it was. And it was a Steffi Graf fan, and obviously no one's blaming Steffi Graf. But the damage that did, I mean, physically, mentally, psychologically, emotionally, in every way. You know, Seles did come back and win 1 more Grand Slam, but I honestly think, and a lot of people will tell you this, had that not happened, we might have been talking about Seles as the GOAT. You know, she could have won easily 15, 20 Grand Slams. So I put that name in there as well, but that's a what if, almost like Borg really on the men's side. And I'll get to that in a sec. And then obviously Serena, you have to talk about Serena Williams. Remarkable, 23 Grand Slams, just been superseded by Djokovic. Yeah, those are probably the names that I'd chuck out on the women's side. And on the men's side, obviously, you've got the big 3. Just a word about Rod Laver, because you can judge the modern era, quote-unquote, of tennis as from 1968, the Open era. And Laver, it's very difficult to compare because he had 1 foot in the closed era and one foot in the Open era. But he did do the calendar Grand Slam twice. I just wouldn't necessarily compare him. I think he's something out on his own. Maybe he is the greatest, but the game is so difficult to compare. I actually did put together a top 10 for what it's worth. This is my top 10 men's players in the Open era, discounting Laver, and here goes. So number 10, I've got Mats Wilander. Honourable mentions to Andy Murray, Guillermo Vilas, maybe even Gerolaitis, Stefan Edberg, Jim Courier, Boris Becker, and I'm sure there's lots of others. Number 9, I've got Andre Agassi. Number 8, I've got McEnroe. McEnroe is very famous, of course, and he had an incredible year in 1984. I think he only lost 2 or 3 matches. One of them that scarred him mentally was the French Open. He was 2 sets up against Lennon and lost. 7, Connors, Jimmy Connors, incredible consistency. Have a look at Connors' record of winning and then finals and semi-finals. He won more Grand Slams than McEnroe, by the way. Number 6, I put Lendl, quite similar, ruled the tennis world, in fact, in the 80s, apart from Wimbledon. Again, that was a bit of a black mark against him, I suppose, that he didn't win Wimbledon. But should that matter? I mean, Wimbledon may be the most prestigious, but it doesn't make it necessarily the most difficult to win. It's just whether you're a grass court player or not. Number 5, I put Borg, Bjorn Borg. This is the big what if. But I mean, he won 11 Grand Slams by the age of 25. So again, it's sort of comparable with Seles, but he quit the game voluntarily. But, you know, you can say then perhaps that's because of the pressure. If you know anything about Borg, the brilliant contrast with him and McEnroe was that McEnroe, everything was external, you know, his feelings went out. Borg bottled his feelings up and never made any exclamations on the court, you know. And someone once said his emotions were as tight as his headband. Bear in mind as well, when you're looking back at history, most of the players didn't play the Australian Open, and the Australian Open was not what it is now. Now it's fully recognised as one of the 4 Grand Slams. Should mention, sorry, I forgot to mention Margaret Court, whose record Djokovic has now equalled. Again, she won a lot at the Australian Open, and I believe she was pre-Open era as well. But yeah, I'm sure had Borg carried on, he would have won a lot more. But he won 5 Wimbledons in a row, and he won 6 French Opens. He was the original king of clay before Rafael Nadal. Number 4, I put Pistol Pete Sampras. And then you got the big 3. I've always put Nadal as number 3, partly because so many of his Grand Slam victories were at one Grand Slam, which is obviously Roland Garros French Open. He's still an absolute legend. I mean, don't get me wrong. And in terms of will to win and everything, and mental strength, physical strength as well, he's groundbreaking. And then number 2, I put Roger Federer. Obviously, he did everything before Novak Djokovic, and Novak Djokovic is just slowly beating all of Federer's records, you know, starting with obviously the Grand Slam record, but then most weeks at number 1, most years ending the year as number 1, most ATP finals, etc., etc. He's just beating most of Federer's records now. Federer did change the game forever, and it's a shame really that maybe Nadal, because he came after Federer, but he's been superseded by Djokovic. That's probably, like I say, why I'd put him at number 3. So anyway, that's my top 10. And I wanted to say something really about Djokovic. I'm going to come on to media in a sec, but this thing about the crowds not liking Djokovic, or Djokovic being very unlikable compared to Federer and Nadal, I think that's absolute rubbish, frankly. I think that's just one of those media creations that, you know, it's just planting an idea that a certain number of people just latch onto and believe. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for that, and we've talked ad nauseum about that. You know, the media create something, and unfortunately, the majority of the public, maybe even the vast majority, just go along with it, really. The things about Djokovic, obviously he went gluten-free at a certain point, and I remember he was pretty much equal with Andy Murray, number 3 in the world, behind Federer and Nadal, about 2010, 11, and that's when he started to make his rise. And Andy Roddick, who's always good value, he was a great player, but he's also a very, very funny guy. He said, oh yeah, I beat Djokovic when he was full of gluten, as they would say in America. There's that, and then there's obviously the vaccine thing, because not only he's now got 2 more Grand Slams than Nadal and 4 more than Federer, but he also missed Wimbledon in 2020, but I suppose Federer and Nadal were still around then, so in theory they could have won that tournament. But he also missed, 3-4 Grand Slams because of the vaccine issue. There was also one where he was disqualified from the US Open for hitting someone with a ball, not intentionally, but he whacked the ball away and it hit somebody. Okay, that's his own fault. But the point I'm making is that at what seems to be his second peak, you know, arguably he's playing as well as ever. I think 2015 was, a lot of people consider the best season by anyone, but he's not too far away from that. And I don't know, I like the guy. I think he's a nice fella, and I'm pretty neutral on Nadal, but Federer I just find a bit smug, and he's too sort of mainstream golden boy, you know, just says all the right things. And, you know, I think he does do charitable work, and I'm sure he's giving a bit back, and I'm sure he's a decent fellow, but he's got the Roger Federer watches, and I think he's bought a bit into how incredible he is. Djokovic took a stand, you know, he cares about what he puts inside his body in terms of gluten and questionable vaccines. I think everyone now would say they're at least questionable. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Anyway, about the actual tennis. Now let's get on to media. So I started a new job, part-time job, to supplement the teaching and life coaching and podcasting a few months ago. And in my car, I put on mainstream radio, breakfast radio, when I'm driving to work in the morning. And when I'm listening to it, I kind of think, I'm kind of analysing it. Not all the time. I'm not, I don't drive myself mad analysing it, but I characterise it as a high-energy fantasy world, the world of breakfast radio. It's perfect for driving to work, really, because the energy never slackens, and you get these news sound bites about important things and cheery travel reports about mayhem on the M25. But the main thing about it is that when I really thought about it, there's an absolute obsession with celebrities. Do a little experiment. I mean, watch mainstream TV, listen to mainstream radio, and you'll only have to wait about a minute before they start talking about celebrities. And oh my God, I met Tom Cruise when I was in America. And the message it's giving you, and I'm not saying that the DJs are doing this on purpose, they're not. Don't know whether they've analysed it or not, but it's all about people who are better than you and better looking than you. And part of that is to do with you buying products, because of course it's all got advertising attached to it. So if you think about it, this world is telling you, it's constantly reminding you that are people with more money and better, more well known than you and more glamorous. And then here's a load of products you can buy. And it's not telling you that you need them to look like Tom Cruise or Angelina Jolie, whoever it is. But that is the subtle message that's been given to you. I kind of take it for what it is. I mean, I like a lot of mainstream content, don't get me wrong. It's just when they start talking about world affairs, then you get what I call the propaganda of presumption, which is the presumption that when it's Ukraine, Putin is only the bad guy. We are only the good guys. It's oversimplified. And also the fact that, in a news bulletin of 2 minutes, this is everything you need to know about an incredibly complex world. And obviously with sport, because I don't have a telly, I do have an app that I was able to watch some of the tennis on. And it's very, very good. I mean, the tennis commentators and summarisers, they're very, very good at their jobs. And, when we're just talking about sport, that's fine. But the only time it started to irritate me is when I was watching Wimbledon and the camera just can't stop looking at Brad Pitt, who happened to be there. And at the US Open, there was Monica Seles, funnily enough. But there was also Matthew McConaughey, and I'll get onto fame in a sec. But that was the irritating bit where they just have to keep going back to Brad Pitt. And what's Brad Pitt doing? He's just basically a normal bloke, because he's not made up and he's not trying to look glamorous. He's just a bloke in a hat watching a tennis match. So why do we need to be constantly reminded that he's there? Because actually most people don't give a shit, honestly. It's just hammering this message that Brad Pitt's important. Brad Pitt's important. It's important that Brad Pitt's there and David Beckham's there and the royal family are there. It's this constant message. But if that wasn't there, no one would care. Seriously, they wouldn't. The other point about sport is that it's inextricably linked to nationalism. Perhaps that's too strong a word. Perhaps I should say patriotism or national identity. And there's this assumption that everyone is proud to represent their country and that they've represented them not just officially, but in spirit as well. I noticed there's a lot of leading questions from interviewers. Just a word about Daniil Medvedev, who lost the men's final. I love that guy. And Djokovic actually said it in his speech. He said, don't change. We love your comments and how honest you are and how authentic you are. Medvedev's got no time for this bullshit. And the woman was saying, her first question was, what is it about America that brings out the best in you, Daniil? And Daniil just basically ignored it and said to Novak Djokovic, what are you still doing here? Saying, why are you still winning Grand Slams? That doesn't make any sense. Fair play, though. I should say one thing. Apart from the issue of Svitolina, the Ukraine player, didn't want to shake hands with Russians or Belarusian players at the net. And I think they understood that, and it wasn't really an issue after a while. Medvedev is very popular, it seems, in America. He does play the pantomime villain, but you'd think, maybe there would be an anti-Russian flavour in how the American media or how the person handing the trophy and doing the interviews would handle him. But, they seem to like him. And similarly with Djokovic, he refused to get the COVID injection, but he doesn't really get treated any differently. Go back to Medvedev, I think it was last year, he lost the Australian Open to Nadal last January. And I'm sure it was that one where they were doing all these speeches about thanking the sponsors and everything. And okay, the sponsors do make it possible and all the corporate stuff. And I'm sure Medvedev was yawning or pretending to yawn. And that was brilliant. I thought he'd get absolutely pilloried for that. But perhaps when you've got enough charisma, you can get away with it. And when people think, oh, he's just being authentic, then, he gets away with it. But anyway, yeah, he's one of my favourites as a personality. So let's get on to the fame aspect. So the big question really is, should we envy Novak Djokovic, Coco Gauff, Brad Pitt, Leo DiCaprio, who was at the US Open hiding his face, didn't want the camera to be on him? Should we envy these people? Should we envy their money? Should we envy that they're doing a job that they all say they love, which I would question that as well. I'll get onto that in a sec. The main thing really is lack of privacy, and think about how annoying it is when someone gossips about you. So let's say you work in an office or whatever, you're a part of a local community, and a lot of people would relate to this who live in small towns or villages. Someone starts spreading a rumour about you and talking to other people, and they all start believing it, and it's untrue. And you get that sense of injustice and that sense of annoyance that people are talking about you and your proverbial ears are burning. Imagine that 1,000-fold and every day. It's much worse if, I don't know, you're someone like Amy Winehouse, who the media knew drank too much and took hard drugs and was vulnerable. And then they just would not leave her alone, and everyone was in on it. When I watched the Amy Netflix documentary, I was so angry about. They showed clips of panel shows making fun of her and stuff, and everyone piles on and gets in on the act. Think about how annoying it is just when lies are being propagated about you on a small scale. So just imagine that. Go back to Federer at Wimbledon this year. It was 20 years since he'd won his first Wimbledon title, and he basically came there to be worshipped. Oh, Roger, golden boy, you're so wonderful. And I was sort of a bit hard on him, thinking, he just wants to come here and be worshipped. But then I'm thinking, what if he said, actually, I don't fancy it? Then you get Federer snubs Wimbledon, and all these people would come out the woodwork. Oh, we gave you so much, Roger. We worshipped you for 20 years, and you're so full of yourself. You're going to snub Wimbledon. Oh, so I suppose he didn't really have any choice. But the worship of celebrity, the thing about it is that apart from the ones with the really massive egos or the ones who've totally bought into their own celebrity, they probably don't even really want it themselves. Like I say, DiCaprio hiding his face. I didn't see him, by the way, but I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about it. I also saw a little clip of the match point in the Gauff Sabalenka match that a fan had obviously made. And just as Gauff, after she embraced Sabalenka, she burst into tears. And like I say, it was an emotional moment. You couldn't help sort of buying into it because it was obviously genuine as well. But in the long shot, you could see that immediately there's photographers just like snapping away. And just imagine that, having a camera in your face all the time. How irritating that would be. Honestly, folks, I haven't experienced it, but I can tell you pretty much for sure that it would get old very quickly, unless you're one of these people that's, I don't know, so deprived of love and attention that you just need it constantly. I also wanted to talk about a couple of victims of fame that are still around now. I'm picking them on the women's side because I can't think of too many examples necessarily on the men's side. I mentioned Jennifer Capriati. If you've never heard of her or you're only a casual tennis fan, you can look up her story. But Naomi Osaka was at Gauff semi-final, and like I said earlier, they had a little moment a few years ago. But, Osaka, she dropped out of the tour and she's just had a baby, and apparently she's going to come back beginning of next year. She was obviously a great player, she won a few Grand Slams. But if you look at her, some of her press conferences, she was regularly breaking down, and you could just see this person is suffering. Yeah, they've got lots of money, but what does that mean when you're suffering? And then we've got Emma Raducanu. Exactly 2 years ago, she won the US Open. Absolutely incredible. 18 years old, a qualifier. She actually got through 3 rounds of qualifying and then won 7 matches and didn't drop a set. So she won 20 sets in a row. And in the main draw, the closest set she had was 6-4. That is just unbelievable. But even before that, at Wimbledon 2021, she got through a few rounds. And then if you remember, she actually had to retire from her match because she was having breathing problems. And I remember saying to someone at the time, she spent basically 2 days or 3 days since the round before that in the full glare of the media, and now she's having breathing problems. May not have been related, but I think possibly they were. And since the US Open win, like I say, exactly 2 years ago, she's done endorsements. She's had something like 5-6 coaches since then. And now she's in a hospital bed having surgeries. With the physical problems, how much is stress related? Doctors are finally, out of nowhere, doctors are now realising that a lot of illness is psychosomatic. Some people say the majority of illness is psychosomatic because the stress affects the cells in your body. I read a book years ago called Never Get Sick Again, and it was arguing that all these diseases and illnesses have names, but in the end they're just cells that malfunction. I remember about 10 years ago, I had a checkup with my local doctor, and I was saying, do you think my physical injuries might be stress-related or psychosomatic? And he literally just looked through me, just totally ignored my question. But I think now they wouldn't do that. And so, do you envy Emma Raducanu? Okay, she'd already made enough money just from winning the US Open to set her up, arguably for life or for the next few years at least. So do you think she feels that she needs to keep accumulating money, or is it the people around her and, the capitalists telling her, you've got to maximise your brand while we can? Regular listeners will know I have this podcast about John Lennon, and I'm a Beatles obsessive, and it's the same with the Beatles in the early days. No one expected it to last, so cash in while we can. And in America, they sold bits of the sheets that they slept on in the hotel, and there was a piece of toast that had been bitten into by George Harrison that got sold. And Paul McCartney told this brilliant story that when he would be at the breakfast table with his kids, they would say, have you finished with that piece of toast, Dad? Even if that's not true, it's still a good story. So, do you envy any of these people? I wouldn't really. I mean, the other question really is sport important? Now, if it makes people feel good, it's important. I mean, I was buzzing, I'll be honest, on Monday morning because I stayed up to watch the men's final and listen to it on the radio. I think I listened to the end of it, and it literally ended as I was dropping off to sleep. I compare sport to being in the cinema. If you're in the cinema watching a really intense film, you sort of buy into the film. But then if you suddenly heard maybe it's not a nice example, but a bomb went off or some loud noise, you heard a gunshot or something that was clearly not coming from the screen. If something happened at the tennis match, God forbid, everyone would quickly be reacting to that and would probably forget they're in a tennis match or at the cinema. So it's one of those. It's important in its own context. Now, I would argue that football has been absolutely deliberately made to seem more important than it is. And it's probably just because of the money that's going around. Maybe it all comes down to money, and that's the reason that sports players are a bit more robotic and a bit more, it's a bit more homogenous now. You don't quite get the characters that you used to. During the pandemic and the lockdown, it was really interesting because they were, like I said, I don't really watch football anymore, but they were showing football matches. And because there was no crowd, you kind of saw it for what it was, which is just a load of blokes kicking around a bag of wind at the end of the day. And they literally had the cup final with nobody there, and it just looked like a training session. And someone scored and the commentator's trying to go ballistic, but it just doesn't work without the crowd. It just seems totally incongruous how excited he is about, like I say, what looks like a glorified training session. And on the TV, you could insert crowd noise in the same way that they have canned laughter in comedy shows. And I thought that was really interesting. But going back to this central question I said of should we envy these people? I mean, we could envy people who like their jobs and have financial security. As I hinted at earlier, I don't think, Novak Djokovic will say, I love tennis. He probably loves what tennis has brought and he likes the victories. But is it glamorous apart from just these big moments, boxing, snooker, swimming 3-4 hours a day? Is that glamorous? Or would that just get unbelievably boring quickly? Just exercising, I like exercising. I like going to the gym. I like the runner's high and all that. But surely that would get a bit old. And I know it's a job and you're getting well paid and people go into work mentality and you think, well, I've got to work. I've got to earn money. But if the things we should envy are liking your job and having financial security, that could apply to, a chartered accountant, and they haven't got any of the hassle of the glare of the media and everything. I pick chartered accountant because accountant is always seen, it's always held up as the least glamorous of jobs. I think the lucky people are the ones that find the job they want. I mean, I had a friend when I was growing up who just loved computers, and you just knew he was going to work in IT and be perfectly happy. But go back to the tennis and things like that. It's a job, but it's got extreme pressure and extreme stress. And to mention John Lennon again, I mean, John Lennon wanted to become a rock star to avoid having to get up early and have a boss in his ear hole telling him what to do. And he ended up touring around the world, hardly getting any sleep, having to wake up early and being told where to be and when. And then he had a boss, as in the head of his record company, in his ear telling him, oh, we need 4 killer singles this year and 2 killer albums. You and Paul need to... Can you do that again? You know, you've had a big hit, but we're not going to pat you on the back too much because we need another one in a couple of months. Can you do that? I think really you should envy maybe mid-level Premier League footballers or top 50 tennis players because they get fabulously rewarded. Because the money as well, I mean, after a while you can't spend that amount of money that Lionel Messi or Novak Djokovic or whoever it is they make. After a while it just becomes zeros because you can't spend that money. If we chuck out a couple of examples from tennis, Gaël Monfils. You look at Gaël Monfils, I mean, he seems to have a fantastic life. And, you know, he's won a few titles and been very well rewarded. But, you know, he seems to enjoy his tennis. And Nick Kyrgios as well. There's a character saying there's no characters in sport. He's sort of made it clear, I don't know if he said this explicitly, but he's intimated, I'd rather enjoy my life than be world number one. Because everyone knows he's got the talent that he could be world number one or could have been, you know, maybe even in the future. But, you know, he'd rather enjoy his life, and it seems like he is doing that. Okay, the media give him a hard time, but he tends to be able to say anything he wants, really, because when it comes from Nick Kyrgios, it's like, oh, well, we expect that. You know, if a really boring person who never says anything controversial suddenly says something controversial, it's probably not going to be good for them because there'll be more spotlight. But if Kyrgios says something controversial, it's like, oh, it's Nick Kyrgios talking. So, all that said, I would like to leave you with an inspirational message. And the message is, as I said, don't envy these people. You know, you have no idea about their lives and all the problems they're having beyond all the problems we know about that Naomi Osaka and Raducanu are having and Coco Gauff's had. And let's just celebrate the fact that we're alive. And I don't think it's very healthy to, let's say, envy people that you've never met. You know, I remember years ago I had a friend in London. I think I've talked about him before. He was a bit older than me and we flat shared. And we were sitting in a pub and I was talking about, I don't know, various problems I was having. And he said, look around this pub. You see everyone's laughing and smiling? When you go out in the pub, people don't really want to be on a downer. And going back to what I was saying earlier, imagine you're on a radio show, the breakfast show. Good morning, everybody. It's really a terrible day. You know, some people have been killed in a plane crash on the other side of the world. And I'm really feeling terrible today. You're not going to stay in your job very long, are you? It's got to be, hi everyone, it's 7 o'clock in the morning and you're listening to BBC Radio 2 and here's some celebrities you need to know about, etc., etc. So, you know, everyone is struggling and suffering, and all the people that you think you envy, they are as well. I could say a lot more, but all in fact I'm going to say 2 things. If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes. And if you're interested in life coaching, I am a life coach and I can fill you with all sorts of good stuff about sport and other types of psychology and things to inspire you in your life. You can write to me at lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com. The other thing I want to say is that the next episode is going to be a compilation of a 2-part appearance I made on the wonderful Luke's English podcast with the wonderful Luke Thompson. If you're wondering what happened to the Darren Brown happiness episodes, they will come after that. It's going to be 2 more of those, and that will pretty much see us to the end of the year and nearly 3 years of Life and Life Only. I might sneak some other stuff in before the end of the year. We'll see. There's obviously going to be parallel content. If you're a new listener, I have 2 other podcasts, Glass Onion on John Lennon and Film Gold. And as my friend Ken McNabb says, it's about spinning plates. You know, I'm juggling my 3 children, and as anyone who's got 3 children knows, it's difficult to give them all absolutely equal love and attention at all times. Film Gold tends to be sidelined slightly, but I tried to divide my attention and tried to get podcast episodes out more or less equally between them. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.